I'm very encouraged to see so many here who are interested in this very important, major life question. I can honestly say there isn't a question I've personally thought or read more about than this one. Being asked to moderate tonight is a great honor. My name is Brian Clark. I'm a University of Alberta chaplain. I have interests in philosophy, theology, communication, and education. I've been involved in listening to this question from personal experience. I have 3 daughters, so I know a little bit about debate. Also through various books and whatever I can get my hands on, and thanks to YouTube, I have seen quite a few of these types of debates, and we'll see this one as well, added to the plethora of debate material. Having explored this topic profitably with our student group last semester, with some great discussion and challenge, I agree with Francis Collins on this point, the former head of the Human Genome Project. Could there be a more important question in all of human existence than, is there a God? It's a truly worthy question to be debated on any university campus. I'm very glad these 2 clubs have worked together to bring this debate to the University of Alberta. And from all I can see here, this is still an issue that students and the thinking public want to deal with and discuss and dialogue on. My hope is that this will be a time to hear the 2 men who have thought deeply about this subject with a respectful atmosphere, intense and careful questioning. Remember this during the Q&A when you want to get angry at me and I cut people off. That people have come to hear these men talk, not necessarily your well-thought-out personal opinions. Maybe you've seen debates before where this is the case, and you go, boy, I'd really like to know what the actual debater thinks on this. I expect it will be tense at times, but I know that such a university setting will remind us to keep our academics' hats on and emotions in check. Who would want to disagree with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who said to Darth Vader, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes"? And yet, here we are with a debate that is addressing this logical either-or issue. Thank you to the Atheist and Agnostic Student Club, to Campus for Christ, for putting on this debate. All profits go to the U of A Food Bank, in case you thought otherwise. We welcome to the U of A, University of Alberta, arguing that God does not exist, PZ, can I say PZ, Myers in the Canadian context? We'll stick with PZ, it's easier. An associate professor of biology at University of Minnesota Morris. Dr. Myers is a public critic of creationism and intelligent design, and the author of the highly popular blog, Pharyngula. I say that right?
You said it right.
Pharyngula, which won the Koufax Award for Best Expert Blog in 2005. And in 2006, it was listed by science journal Nature as the top-ranked blog written by a scientist. We also welcome Kirk Durston, who is arguing God does exist. He's the national director of the New Scholars Society, which is an organization that promotes Christian scholarship in every field, with a special interest in those areas where philosophy, faith, and science intersect. Mr. Durston is currently a PhD candidate in biophysics at Guelph. Now, following formal debate procedure, both speakers are setting up arguments based upon this resolution. I doubt you'll memorize this, but just so you know, this is the resolution. Let God be defined as a personal, supernatural being, one that created the physical universe and actively intervenes in it. Let it be resolved that God exists. On this, the organizers from both clubs have both agreed for obviously the pro and con position. And our format is as follows. Follow it as closely as we can. It'll be much more helpful than a free-for-all. The opening remarks by each speaker, 20 minutes, with no response from the second speaker. Then a response by each, 12 minutes. And then closing remarks by each, 5 minutes. Then comes a time of question and answer, alternating with each speaker. We'll be coming down the aisles here, and we'll have those asking the theist questions on this side, and the questions to PZ or Z on that side. I'll deal with this later again, but just so you know, that's what's happening. Rules for the debate, what we're all waiting to hear. Use common sense, please. No interrupting by either debater, which I know won't happen, or audience, and show respect for full minutes of each section of this debate format. There'll be a timer, he's right there, to assist the debaters with cards for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 1 minute, and stop time. I'll try to be gracious, but I will probably say these words to one or both of these men, finish that thought, and that means it'll be fairly close to being done what they're saying. Really close, actually. The moderator does have the right to cut in to what's happening. So that's another rule. If they're over the time allotment, just so you know that up front. I'm sure that won't be the case. This being said, everyone knows the ground rules. We'll now toss a coin for speaking order. Note, if I get the coin right, it is not a U.S. coin. That's nothing against PZ, but maybe you can figure out why I said that. So I guess I have to figure out who's who. Heads or tails? What's that?
Heads.
Heads, tails? Yes. Okay. Can you hold that for a second? Is this fair? Did I do that fair? It says heads. Heads. So the first speaker then, did you say heads?
I said tails.
You said tails. Then they will be Kirk. Wow, I was going to anyway. No. All right, the first speaker for 20 minutes will give their opening remarks, and then the second will come up right after with their 20 minutes of remarks. Sure, your floor.
Yep. Just hold on. Okay. I first of all also want to thank the two clubs that have sponsored this event. It's a very important question, and I want to begin with just briefly looking at why it is an important question before I move on into my two arguments for the existence of God. I think this question is important for both society and for the individual, so let's take a look at society first. I want to look at the track record of atheism for those societies where it was a core belief. By core belief, I mean it was a belief from which other beliefs arose, were centered around, and their actions resulted as a result of that as well. There's an urban myth propagated by various people, such as Christopher Hitchens and others. The religion has killed more people than anything else in history. It's been the source of more pain and suffering than anything else in history. However, there is a political scientist at the University of Hawaii who specializes, or his expertise is in the area of mass murder throughout history. And when you take a good look at his website, which I've listed down below, and begin to look at what types of societies are responsible for the most killing in human history, it turns out that societies where atheism was a core belief have accounted for over 143 million murders just in the 20th century alone. And I've only looked at the top 5 atheist societies. The single greatest killer of humanity has been societies that held atheism as a core belief. There are many Christians, for example, who believe in God, but it does not affect the way they live. We call those hypocrites. There are many atheists. There are many atheists whose non-belief in God does not really affect the way they think and live. I'm not talking about those. There are even societies today that have many people in that society, perhaps even a majority that have atheists where it's not a core belief. It's just like these Christians, they think there's no God or there is a God, but it doesn't really affect the way they live. But where you have societies where it becomes a core belief, it's taught to the children and it's enforced, they're expected to build their worldview around the idea that there is no God, this is what I'm talking about. So the bottom line is this, is that if atheism becomes a core belief, it can be extremely destructive for society and for human rights in general. On the other hand, there have been a number of papers over the last decade or so that talk about and reveal the positive benefits of belief in a God, especially if they believe in a God that's interested in your moral activity. The most recent one was a few months ago in the journal Science. They found that people who believe in such a God have a tendency towards increased generosity, experimentally induced religious thoughts, reduce rates of cheating, and increase altruistic behavior. Experiments demonstrate an association between religious devotion and greater trust. And the bottom line is this, is that societies that embrace theism as a core belief seem to flourish and advance in positive ways. Of course, this does not speak to whether or not there actually is a God, such a God as what they're believing in, but what it does say is that there are positive social benefits for the belief in the existence of God. But for the individual as well, it's important. If there is no God, then there are massive philosophical implications for each one of you here tonight. For example, there is no meaning to life. You just make it up. You have no you have no intrinsic value or significance, at least no more than say a tapeworm or some toxic waste. You just make that up, or other people assign it to you. On the other hand, if God does exist, then the kind of life that you live right now and experience right now and your quality of life right now and your eternal destiny just might hinge on that information. Before I introduce the two arguments, I want to make something clear, is that my arguments will not be proof in the logical sense or the strict mathematical sense. Rather, they will be rational justification for the belief in the existence of God. And I would like to go even further than that and argue that the most rational position to hold between atheism and theism is theism, the belief that God exists. So let's begin with my first argument, the argument from nature. Modern science seems to have indicated or revealed to us that nature itself appears to have had a beginning. Space-time, matter, and energy exploded into existence at some point in the past, and I want to emphasize that time itself seems to have had a beginning sometime in the past. So it's not only that. What it also appears is that the universe appears to be incredibly fine-tuned to be able to support life. And when you look at the set of all possible universes and then the subset of those universes capable of supporting life, we find that the probability of, in a one-shot deal, getting any kind of universe at all that's capable of supporting life, according to Roger Penrose, a colleague of Stephen Hawking, is roughly 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. And if this universe is a one-shot deal, we've got massively lucky. And normally when you see people get lucky like that, you start to ask questions and launch an investigation. At least the Lottery Commission does. This has prompted Stephen Hawking to state the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications whenever you start to discuss the origins of the universe. There must be religious overtones, but I think most scientists prefer to shy away from the religious side of it. There are 3 major categories right now of theories of nature, and the first major category is that this universe is a one-off deal. There was a Big Bang, and there are many different variations of that theory, and as a result, here we are today. It's a one-off deal. Another theory is the multiverse theory, and again, there's a large number of different subsets within that theory. It posits a very large number of universes, not an infinite number, but a very large number. This universe was spawned by a previous one, perhaps a quantum fluctuation at the event horizon of another universe, which itself was a product of a previous one. But the problem of an infinite regression still requires a beginning in the multiverse theory. So in that theory of nature that includes a multiple set of universes, there still must be a beginning in this multiple set and this ongoing spawning of new universes. Then there's the M theory. About 2 months ago, I attended a lecture by Neil Turok at the University of Guelph where he expounded upon his theory of how the universe began. Basically colliding brains in 11-dimensional space, an offshoot of string theory. But at the end of the lecture, he said there are still 3 big questions, and one of the big questions is, how did it all begin? And my point is this, that no matter which theory of nature you hold to, all of them still require a beginning to nature itself, no matter how you define it. So the question that arises then, is there a scientific explanation for the origin of nature, including time itself? Now, we could say there's no explanation or not worry about it. We could say nothing caused it. It just exploded into existence of absolutely nothing. Problem is that that is irrational to hold, that nothing caused or explains nature. And the reason is that rational thought involves propositions that lead to or explain the conclusion. Simply asserting the conclusion with no rational propositions to explain it or lead up to it is an irrational proposition. So I reject the idea that nothing created the universe, and that leaves us with this proposition. The cause or explanation for nature, regardless of which of the three major categories you hold, is either natural or not natural. And that's a true dichotomy. It's either one or the other. If it's not natural, I'm defining that as supernatural, not natural/supernatural. At this point, it's important to consider the logical fallacy known as a circular argument. It assumes the conclusion in the opening premise and then proves the conclusion from that assumption. That being the case, you cannot assume the existence of natural processes to explain the origin of natural processes. You cannot assume the existence of nature in order to come up with a natural explanation for the origin of nature. It is a logical fallacy to think that you can come up with a natural or a scientific explanation for the origin of nature itself. And I see this as a very, very serious problem for the atheist. Perhaps it's checkmate. I don't know. We'll see what happens. There's another question. What brought time into existence? Now, to avoid the circular fallacy again, we cannot assume the existence of time as part of your explanation as to how time came into existence. Therefore, the cause of time itself, which I'll refer to as omega, simply to put a name on it, must exist within either a timeless reference frame or be a timeless reference frame. But if that's the case, any object that exists within a timeless reference frame cannot itself have a cause. Now think about that carefully, because many people will say, well, then what caused omega? But the moment you ask that question, you're assuming there was a time omega did not exist, and then something caused it to come into existence, and now it exists. But in a timeless reference frame, there is no time. You cannot assume time in a timeless reference frame. So for any x or for any omega in a timeless reference frame, necessarily x exists in a timeless state always. There is no past or future in that condition. Therefore, it's logically impossible for omega to have a cause. Omega is timeless, and it reminds me of one of the primary names for God in Judeo-Christianity, I am, which implies for God, the God of Judeo-Christianity, there is no past, there is no future. Everything is in the present tense. God transcends time. He is the ultimate reference frame and is a timeless reference frame. So in summary, my first argument is as follows. The cause of nature must be either natural or not natural. In other words, supernatural. But we've already seen that the circular fallacy precludes us from claiming that the cause of nature must be natural. Therefore, it must be not natural or supernatural. Fourth, the cause of time must be timeless, again, to avoid the circular fallacy, and therefore the cause of time cannot itself be caused. Therefore, the cause of nature is supernatural and uncaused. So in conclusion for my first argument, omega is a supernatural, eternal, and uncaused creator of the universe. Omega corresponds to humanity's general notion of God, a supernatural creator of nature who is eternal and uncaused. Omega also corresponds to the Christian understanding of God, who is known as the I Am and the Alpha and the Omega. And this would also explain the incredible fine-tuning of nature in the same way that a person down the street who wins the lottery every week for a year straight, upon the investigation by the Lottery Commission, finds that they've been cheating, they've been fudging the system. We have a possible explanation for why the universe is so incredibly fine-tuned. That brings me to my second argument, and it begins with a question. Has Omega ever stepped into space-time and revealed himself to humanity? What we want to do is search for a ground zero in history, an event that had a massive impact on history, and it's even better if the shockwaves from that historical event extend forward and backward in time, which would suggest that the origin of the shock wave, or that ground zero, may be timeless. Problem here is that anyone who claims to be I am or God should supply sufficient warrant, and better be pretty good warrant, to justify us taking that person seriously. So my second argument is as follows. Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be God. There is warrant for believing he was telling the truth. Therefore, there is warrant for believing that God exists and is active in history. If you grant the first two propositions, the third one logically follows. So let's look at those first two propositions, because some people deny that he claimed to be God. Let's look at a couple of instances here. First of all, he went around claiming that he could forgive the sins of all humanity. And in the Hebrew society, we see their response here by the leaders, the religious leaders. They said, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So to claim to forgive sins was a claim to deity in that society. Then Jesus went on to say, for my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Here's a fellow who's claiming that anybody, including everyone in this room, who believes in him will have eternal life, and he will personally raise you from the dead at the end of human history. Not your normal claims. Another time he came right out and said it. He said, before Abraham was born, I am. And immediately the crowd took up stones to kill him because he had just used God's primary name in that Hebrew culture as his own name. He claimed to be I am. Finally, he said, why do you want to kill me? They said, because of blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. So you got to realize that these religious leaders were people who were raised in the culture. They knew the culture. They spoke the language. And it was their understanding, not a 21st century interpretation, but their understanding that he was committing blasphemy. And we see this recorded in extra biblical sources, not friendly to Christianity, that he was actually committing blasphemy. So, to drive this point home that he was claiming to be God, let me summarize it. He was claiming there is a moral law that describes how humans ought to behave. Not how we actually behave, but how we ought to behave. He claimed that every member of humanity has violated that moral law, and as a result, we are in deep trouble with the one who gave the moral law, with I am. But he also claimed to be I am. His solution was that he had stepped into space-time as a human being, and he would die for all the moral infractions of all humanity, so that any person who put their faith in him, in Jesus Christ, as the one who could forgive their sins and give them eternal life, that person would have eternal life. Now, my point is this. That is a claim to deity. Not just any kind of God at all, but the Judeo-Christian God who is known as I am. He was claiming to be that person. Now, the second proposition is that there's warrant for believing he was telling the truth. Those are audacious claims. And I would suggest there's two lines of warrant. One has to do with his fulfillment of the ancient messianic prophecies. And the second are the three lines of historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth actually rose from the dead in 33 A.D. Assume for the sake of argument that the Old Testament is just a collection of myths and fairy tales. Now, I realize for the atheists and agnostics, that would be a safe assumption. I don't ask you to believe, in something you don't already hold to be true. So we'll assume that it is a collection of myths and fairy tales. But one thing you must also accept is that it was written before the time of Jesus of Nazareth. We have hard copy, we have fragments of the Old Testament, some of which predate the time of Jesus in museums today. The interesting thing about that Old Testament is that it made many, dozens and dozens of very specific predictions or prophecies about this Messiah who would come at some point in history. And Jesus fulfilled those against impossible odds. For example, here are some examples. It prophesied that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, but will have existed from infinity past. It prophesied the Messiah would arrive exactly 483 years after the decree to rebuild the temple. At the time that prophecy was made, Jerusalem and the temple were in ruins, having been destroyed by the Babylonians. We know when that decree was made. You can add 483 years to that, and it turns out that corresponds to AD 29, the exact year Jesus began his public ministry in Israel. Could be a coincidence, maybe not. It prophesied the Messiah would be actually killed or executed before the destruction of the Second Temple. We know that occurred in 70 AD under the Romans. Jesus was executed in 33 AD. Other prophecies indicated the Messiah would die for the sins of all humanity and then rise from the dead. And there are three lines of evidence that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. Other prophecies stated that God himself would one day be born as a little boy and that it would be valued at 30 pieces of silver, and that person would one day rule the world. And by coincidence, Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah, was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, and he stated that someday he will return and rule the world when humanity has had their chance, at a time popularly known as Armageddon. This is unique in history. First of all, the prophecies. There is no other historical figure in history, religious or otherwise, that has had many prophecies made about them hundreds and even 1,000 years before they came, that they were able to fulfill. Another thing that's unique is what is now known as Christianity started more than 1,000 years before Christ arrived. That's unusual and unique among the world religions. In every other case, you have a religious leader show up, invent a new religion, and off she goes, a slow start, but it becomes quite popular. In this case, it starts more than 1,000 years before the religious leader shows up. That is unique in history. And the source of information about the future must transcend time. If, in fact, this collection of so-called myths and fairy tales, and that's all I ask you to accept, it's myths and fairy tales for the sake of the argument, made statements about the future that came true, then the people who wrote down that collection must have had a source of information that transcends time. That is, the source already exists in the future, can relay information into the past, they write it down, and that's how the predictions can come true. My second line of warrant for thinking maybe Jesus could be taken seriously is there's actually 3 lines of historical evidence that he rose from the dead, and I'll just choose one for lack of time, but I've chosen the one that you can most easily verify on your own afterwards, and that is the explosion of Christianity in Jerusalem, such that many thousands of people believed that Jesus was God and he'd risen from the dead with only weeks of his alleged resurrection. And the shock waves, and by the way, this occurred in a strict monotheistic society, and it also occurred amid fierce religious opposition. The shock wave spread throughout the Roman Empire within 30 years and as far as India. And there's external confirmation of this in the writings of Flavius Josephus, who lived at the same time as the explosion of Christianity and of the apostles. He was a Roman historian. So my second argument is this. Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be God. There is highly unusual warrant for believing he was telling the truth, and therefore there is warrant for the belief that God exists and is active in history. So my challenge to atheism are these. What is your non-natural explanation for the origin of nature, including time itself, and the incredible fine-tuning of the universe to support life, which may suggest a purpose? What is your explanation for the existence of the ancient messianic prophecies and Christ's ability to fulfill them? And what is your explanation for the explosion of Christianity within weeks of Christ's alleged resurrection?
Now for PZ's opening remarks with no responses allowed, simply his remarks.
Okay, do we have this up? Do we have it up? No, we don't. Let me check. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, first of all, happy monkey, U of A. I'm glad to be here. I love to travel to exotic foreign lands, even if they look exactly like Minnesota. Why couldn't you guys be the University of Hawaii? You're all thinking this now, too, aren't you? Okay, well, first thing I have to do is I have to disagree with our moderator. I feel bad about this. We have this question that we're supposed to debate. Do leprechauns exist? And I have to tell you, it's a really silly question. It's the 21st century. No one believes in little elves running around, pots of gold and all that. Oh, wait. Oh, okay, gods. It's the same thing. This is the 21st century. Why are we believing in this ridiculous stuff? This is not a serious question. You have brought me all this way to talk about nonsense. You should be a little bit embarrassed about this. But okay, I will try to discuss it. What I'm going to do is we'll try to have a little fun with it, and we'll try to learn a little bit from it. The first thing I want to mention is the 2 things I'll talk about. The first thing I want to say is that there's no evidence of intervention by any supernatural force in the history of life on Earth, and God-based explanations are inconsistent and incoherent. They make absolutely no sense. I've read the Bible. Trust me, it's crap. Really. This is stuff cobbled together, a whole collection of various myths built together, and there's no reason to think that these are actually authoritarian, informed discussions of the origin of the world. The other thing I want to do is I'll try to get some information to you guys, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of some pattern-forming mechanisms. So every biological phenomenon that we have examined in sufficient detail has been found to be explainable by purely natural causes. We don't have to go hunting for gods to explain how these various processes involved. Now, this is not to say that we have figured everything out. We have not. There's huge areas of mystery, things we don't know about yet. But you can't use those gaps in our knowledge to argue one way or the other. All we can say is that we have a track record, and the track record is very, very good for science. And science does not invoke any kind of god or leprechauns or whatever fantasy mythological figure you want to invent. So my conclusion is going to be simply this. Therefore, probably not. Now, I don't say absolutely not, because we can't say absolutely anything. All we can say is, according to this, is that one explanation, that there are gods, is very, very silly. And the other explanation, that natural causes can explain it, is actually working out pretty well. We're not done with it, but it's getting there. It's doing a very good job. So let's talk a little bit about where I'm going to focus, and that's the argument from design, that I kind of expected that that's what we'd be discussing today. And you've all heard of this guy, William Paley, who came up with this idea in 1803. Well, at least he wrote it up in 1803 in his book Natural Theology, this whole metaphor of finding a stone or a watch on a heath. And you'd say, well, the watch was manufactured by intelligent beings. And this has been spun into a huge industry now with organizations like the Discovery Institute, building up a huge repertoire of stories built around this, just pointing to things that are incredibly complex and saying, okay, that's so complex, it couldn't have evolved. It must have been built by design. This is an invalid argument. It simply doesn't work. Complicated things are built by chance all the time. Complexity is actually the hallmark of a lack of design. Well-designed things tend to be smooth and simple and efficient and properly put together. And when we look at biology, what we find is not something that is designed. What we find is something that's cobbled together in all kinds of interesting ways. I would also say that William Paley's argument is bogus because he does not mention what he would say if he found a rabbit hopping around on the heath. And I think we'd all agree that a rabbit is much, much more complicated than a watch. We would not postulate upon seeing a rabbit that there was a factory nearby where busy engineers were turning them out. We know where rabbits came from. Mommy and daddy rabbits. And they're not educated labor, okay? They're not very smart. This is not intelligent design. Okay, so I'm going to be arguing against the whole design argument. The first thing I want to talk about then is my initial statement that religious explanations for the origin of the world are ridiculous. Definitely ridiculous. Incoherent and inconsistent. So let's look at an explanation for the creation of the world. This is a pretty good one. Like I said, I'm from Minnesota. We got lots of those Swedes and Norwegians there. We kind of like this one. So this is the old Norse creation story that says the world was created from the flesh and bones of a giant named Ymir. Does this resonate with anybody? Is anybody excited about this? You think we should be arguing this? Maybe I should have focused the debate on this. Is the Norse creation story true or not? It'd be hard to find anybody who'd support this. Okay, this is a long dead one, but what about this one? Hello? Well, we'll get there. Okay, wait a minute. Stupid thing is acting up on me. There we go. Here's another one. Okay, what about this one? There may be some people in this room who like this one. This is the Hindu creation story. And, I think this is probably the prettiest creation story I've ever read. Isn't that nice? I mean, it's very poetic, very metaphorical. There's Lord Vishnu waking up and deciding to create the world and sending Brahma off to do it. That's lovely. How many here believe it? Oh, okay, good. Okay, we got one. Okay, well, what about this one? Don't laugh too hard. There might be some Scientologists here, and they tend to sue people. Okay, so here's a Scientology creation story. Zeno is this galactic tyrant who flies a bunch of people he doesn't like off to Earth and blows them up, and their little spirits are floating. Okay, it's a very silly story, just like the other ones. I think this one's a little less poetical than the Hindu story. I don't quite like it as much. What about this one? Is this one better than those other three? Why should we accept this one over the Scientology story? Is there any grounds for seeing that this is a better story? It's vague. There's a dearth of detail. It's clearly poetic, right? Like many of the other, everything except L. Ron Hubbard's work is poetic. It's intended metaphorically. This is not an explanation for the origin of the world. Religion does not provide a good explanation for the origin of the world. You could argue that this is a metaphorical story, a poetical story, to help people think about their place. Just to give them a little filler from a bunch of ignorant savages living 4,000 years ago who were at least trying to build a foundation of scholarship and thinking about the world. As I said earlier, the scientific explanation is not complete. I think we should give some credit to these guys. They did not have a complete story either. They're taking some guesses. This is a guess that did not pan out. Neither did the Hindu story, or the Scientology story, or the Norse story. These are all stories that sound nice, but they have no meaning. Now, the important thing is that there's no criteria for resolving which of these stories should be held as true. If you go to India, you'll find lots of people that think that Vishnu's story is the best one. If my opponent had been born in India, that's the one he'd be arguing for. If I'd been born there, I'd be arguing the same thing I am today. One of the virtues of being an atheist. So what we're seeing here is these vague myths that are proposed, and we're supposed to accept these as explanations for a creator God. I don't think so. Okay, but let's turn to something specific. Let's instead of playing around with myth and superstition, let's ask, what kinds of things does science do? What kind of stories does science tell? Now, I'm not going to go all the way back to the Big Bang. That's way outside my field. I'm a developmental biologist. I'm interested in biological events. I'm particularly interested in things like the evolution of multicellular animals, which occurred roughly 600 million years ago. So that's as far back as I'm going to go. And we can ask, does the Bible provide any information there? Well, first of all, this doesn't. If you read all of Genesis, you won't find much at all about things like the evolution of insects. They're kind of lumped together. They're the creepy, crawly things that emerge on one of those 6 days. And they're also called unclean and horrible things like that. So they're not treated with much depth. When you want to find out the real answers to questions like that, you have to turn to somebody who's actually concerned about issues like, where did insects come from? Where did multicellular animals come from? What kind of features evolved to create them? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get specific, and we're going to talk about one tiny little narrow aspect of evolutionary developmental biology, and that's the Hox genes. You may have heard of these. Who's heard of Hox genes? Yeah, okay. Many of you, but not all of you. Hox genes are really cool genes. They were first identified in the 60s. They were first characterized molecularly in the 80s. But they're very nifty genes that are involved in all kinds of processes that specify pattern. And by pattern, we mean when you start off with a little embryo that's featureless and faceless and doesn't have much of an orientation, you've got to have some genes that turn on and tell it which end is up. Which end will develop the head, which will develop the chest, the stomach, the legs, etc. Okay, all that stuff has to be specified. So you have to have a metric that lays down these patterns. And the particular gene that does, class of genes that does this are the homeobox-containing genes, the Hox genes. And this is a very complicated diagram, which I don't expect you to understand everything about. But over here on the right, what we have is just a diagram of what they are. Homeobox genes are just genes that fold in a particular way to fit into the DNA molecule. That's what they do. They bind to DNA. And what they do is they bind in specific regions of DNA where they regulate the expression of other genes. So Hox genes are kind of switches that flow through the cell and turn on other genes. Homeobox-containing genes are called this because they contain a particular motif, a particular sequence of nucleotides that are produced into amino acids, 180 nucleotides long. And that's just what this little stuff over here is, this complicated stuff. And I put this up there to illustrate a couple of things. One is you can look at the sequence of these genes and you can see something of their structure. This is called a helix loop helix protein. And all it means is it's got these little segments, helix 1, helix 2, and helix 3, 4, that form little spiral helices. And they have little hinge points, and they fold in particular ways. And that's how you make the little thing that fits right there. When you look at this sequence, what you see is illustrated up there. At the top is the amino acid code specifying which amino acids are present in particular locations. And what you can see is there's a lot of slop in the rest of the diagram. So the top is the consensus sequence. That's what you commonly find. But down below, each amino acid position is listed a series of alternative amino acids that you find in different homeobox proteins and in different animals. So this is a protein that folds in a specific way, but as you can see, it tolerates a fair amount of variation in its sequence. That sequence is also specific for allowing it to bind to particular regions of the DNA. Okay, so when this gene is produced in the cell, in the animal, what does it do? Well, it's going to be expressed in particular regions. For instance, there is a Hox gene that is turned on in a nice little band right up here in the head of the embryo. Another one a little farther back. And another one a little farther back. So these little stripes of specific Hox genes, members of this Hox gene family, specify what you will be, what these particular pieces of your face will be. We can stain for these things. This is a really cool image. What they did is they took each of these Hox genes and they tied it to a colored agent so that you could then stain for that particular Hox gene. You can ask, where is that Hox gene being turned on? And what you can then find is that there's a series of them. So, for instance, there's one called labial, or lab for short, and they attached a pink-colored probe to this. And you can see that little pink band up there. That's up in the very front end. It's labial. It forms the tongue of the fly. And back behind that is deformed in green, and sex chromes reduced in blue, and antennapedia in yellow, ultrabithorax in red, and then abdominal A and abdominal B farther back. It's really cool stuff, right? We can see this pattern. It's expressed there in the animal. And we know that this is very important in specifying the identity of positions along the embryo. We know this because we can do experiments and muck this up. We can change these things around. We now have the power to go into these animals and swap expression patterns of these particular genes. And we can do things that are very nifty but kind of cruel to the animal. We can do things like make them sprout legs for where their antennae should be and make extra wings. We can shut down limb formation in the thorax so that it looks like the abdomen just by tinkering with these particular genes. Okay, so this was cool. This was figured out back in the 60s, like I said. Here are these genes expressed in this nice pattern. In the 80s, when we sequenced them, we discovered another surprise, and that's illustrated here. When they sequenced the fly, they were looking for where in the chromosomes are these genes. And they found labial. There it is, on a particular strand of DNA. So this little cartoon is illustrating a strand of DNA. They found labial. And then they went looking for proboscidea, which is PB. That's one that's expressed in the proboscis, as you might imagine. And it was right next to labial. It was right behind it. And then they went looking for zirconalt, deformed, sex chromosomes reduced, etc. And they found them all expressed right next to each other in this cluster, this Hox cluster. And the Hox cluster maps perfectly in its organization onto the pattern of expression in the animal's body. Now, isn't that nifty? So here's these genes. They're neatly arrayed. And what you find when you look at the animal developing is it turns on the frontmost gene in the frontmost part of the animal, the hindmost gene in the hindmost part of the animal. So here's a place where we find morphology mapped into the structure of the chromosome. Okay, this is cool. This is very complex. What we have here is a molecule that has high binding specificity. It has specific roles in morphology. It has a highly specified arrangement on the genes of the chromosome. And we will tell you right off the bat, these are not the products of pure chance. You don't get this just by chance. This is the product of selection. You might ask, where did these things come from in the first place? Where did Hox genes originate? Did they just poof into existence? And no, we don't think so at all. I mentioned earlier that they were helix loop helix proteins. There are tons of helix loop helix proteins. These are really easy things for cells to make. There's lots of them all over the place in your genome. They're just general DNA binding proteins. They just fold into a shape that happens to fit the notch of DNA. And these are found all over the place. Some of them have a particular specific sequence. That homeobox sequence I showed you earlier, that's a subset of the helix loop helix proteins. And we can use molecular clocks, and we can look at the distribution of these genes across the animal and plant and bacterial kingdom. We can ask, when did these things appear? And that was roughly 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, we estimate. That's that little red dot right down there. So that's the origin of the first homeobox gene. And when we say origin, what we mean is it's just a modified helix loop helix protein. And what we find is when we look in bacteria, when we look in plants, when we look at all animals, we find these things all over the place. They're very common. So if you follow this cladogram up, there's a branch point after the origin of the homeobox gene. If you look in plants, you can find homeobox-containing genes in plants. Okay? Like I said, all over the place. So what's special about them in us? This is this event that occurred about 600 million years ago, and that's the origin of the first homeobox cluster. And that's represented up there by one organism, the Hydra, which you've probably run into if you've taken any introductory biology classes. It's this neat little cnidarian. It's microscopic. You can see it. It's got a stalk with a couple of tentacles hanging off of it that it uses to feed. This is an animal that's got polarity. It's got a back end, the stalk, and it's got a head end, which has got the tentacles on it. And what it's got is precisely 2 Hox genes. One is for specifying the front end, the other is for the back end. Okay, so this is a key innovation in multicellular animals, is simply having a couple of genes that are switched on in different regions of the body so that you can differentiate a head versus a tail. I mean, just imagine how awful it would be to have your head indistinguishable from your tail. You depend on your Hox genes to do this. You look a little farther up, there's the nematodes. These are worms, again, microscopic worms. They are slightly more complicated than Hydra. And what you find there is that they have 4 Hox genes. Okay, so they got 4 in a row, all in a nice little bank. We think now that that's probably the result of a little degeneration. They probably initially had more, but you get the principle. They have more Hox genes. They have more complicated anterior-posterior organization. Then we look at something like a beetle. Insects in general have about 8 or 9 Hox genes. And these Hox genes specify the identity of the various regions along the length of the animal. Antennae side, mouth parts with eyes, cervical regions, the different subdivisions of the thorax and the abdomen. And we got to throw us chordates in there. There's Amphioxus. Amphioxus has 12 Hox genes. And why does it have more? It's got a tail. Turns out these extra Hox genes are turned on specifically in the tail.
If you could finish your opening remarks.
Oh, that went by so fast. Okay. There's so much to tell you. We know the mechanism for this particular process. We can do gene duplication to make these things. Consequences of gene duplications have been worked out. We know the history of this in forming the specific segments of the insect. And further, we've discovered these same things in us. In mice, mammals, birds, we have the same pattern. We've had extra duplications that define this. And just to conclude this, then, I had so much I could have told you. First of all, there's no design theory. There's no equivalent design theory that tells us anything like this. Nothing in the Bible is going to account for this. There is an evolutionary theory that explains these processes in detail and with concrete evidence that can be shared among anybody who's Hindu, Muslim, Christian, atheist. It doesn't matter. Gods can't be disproven, but they have been demonstrated to be superfluous, inconsistent, illogical, and unreasonable explanations with no foundation in evidence. And my final word, the explanation is I have no need of that hypothesis. Thank you.
Mr. Durston will now give his 12-minute response.
Okay. You're going to give me some time cards there, will you? Okay, good. I want to begin with some of the introductory remarks that Professor Myers made regarding belief in God being silly, God of the Bible being an unpleasant word. I want to remind you of a logical fallacy known as the donkey's laugh. The donkey's laugh occurs when you make fun of something or laugh at something and thereby conclude that you have actually proved that proposition false. And some of these things, some of these statements, like this is a serious question. And simply by laughing at it or calling it crap, it does not logically follow that therefore God does not exist. It might be funny though, and I'd have to admit, PZ has a good sense of humor, and I often find myself laughing at some of the things he writes on his blog too. I can't help it. They're funny. But you got to be careful. We got to think logically here. Does it logically follow that therefore there is no God simply because of something being that he refers to as something as silly? Also, you got to be careful that because leprechauns are not likely to exist, does it logically follow therefore that nothing supernatural exists? What about I am? What about Omega? And so, again, you've got to think very critically and very clearly on these issues. You may be able to reject a whole series of candidates for the supernatural, leprechauns, the Easter Bunny, for example. But once in a while, a candidate might emerge as having maybe a little more warrant for believing possibly there might be some warrant for believing that exists. And that's what I presented in my first argument. Then he said that we do not need the existence of God to explain, for example, the origin of the... Well, I'm not sure he's saying that. I don't want to put words in his mouth. He did refer to the creation account in the Bible for the cosmos. It's vague. It lacks details. It's poetic. I got no problem with that. I'd be prepared to grant that. It doesn't follow that because maybe I just say so-and-so did this, that therefore so-and-so doesn't exist. Or that the idea that God created the world and there's no details given that therefore God does not exist, or we don't need God to explain that. What I showed in my first argument, and what PZ will have to respond to in his next time up, is this origin of nature problem. That sooner or later you cannot just be evoking nature to explain nature, you come to the problem of being able to explain nature without the circular argument. The only point, I think, in that opening verse of Genesis is that God is claiming that he's responsible for the origin of space-time, matter, and energy. That's the only point. No more details are required. The Bible is not meant to be a book on cosmology or theoretical physics. The whole point is that God takes responsible for the origin of nature. It's a non-natural source. I want to move into the second idea that he presented here, and that is that it's kind of hard to know exactly what his argument was. It wasn't really laid out in the form of a syllogism, so I'm going to try and interpret that argument and respond to it the best way I can. And I think what he is saying there is that there is an evolutionary theory, that last point, that explains And I didn't have time to write it all down, but basically everything that we are wondering about in evolution or in biology. I'm not sure he goes that far, though. He did admit there's some things we don't understand. I want to point out talk about the Hawks homeobox complex. That I'm prepared to grant that. That's not a problem. In fact, I'll go further than that and say that small changes in the regulatory aspect of the genome can produce massive phenotypic changes. That is, massive changes in the structure. We can perform experiments that do those sorts of things. In other words, we have a piece of software here. And this is one of the problems that's been raised recently in a paper by, I just got it on here. I won't take the time to fire up my laptop. Basically, it states that chance and necessity do not explain the origin of life. And the reason that they give in the abstract is that the information encoded in the genomes of life seems to be cybernetic in nature. That is, there are decision nodes. This looks like software. Chance and necessity do not write software. That's the problem. And so once you've got the software, once you've got this system that PZ was talking about, you can play around with that software. Small changes in the software can produce radical changes in the output. Fine, I'm prepared to grant that. My question is, how do you get that software in the first place? More specifically, what is your explanation for the origin of the information that encodes the various proteins in life? That is a serious, serious problem in biology. You can get an idea of the kind. There's a couple of papers recently published, one in Proceedings of National Academy of Science by Hazen and other colleagues, that defines this concept of functional information. And you can actually calculate the functional information required to produce a protein. It's not that difficult. You go to PFAM, for those of you who are in biology, know what I'm talking about. Download the sequences for the entire protein family. I've done that, for example, for quite a few different proteins. Ubiquitin is one example I'm working with right now. You can download 2,400 sequences. You call out the redundancy. You get 1,000 unique sequences, 1,000 different sequences for ubiquitin. You can then calculate the probability distribution of the amino acids on each site, and using that formula published by Hazen, compute the exact amount of information, or at least estimate a ballpark figure, at the very least, of how much information is required. And it turns out that for the average universal proteins are found in every organism in life. For the average one, we're looking at about 400 bits of information. So to just say that biology can produce these things, you've got to have some way of testing that hypothesis. The first thing you've got to do is figure out how much information is required. Once that is done, then you can say, okay, do the mechanisms we're talking about here, are they capable of producing that? Well, chance will not. Definitely will not. So we have to invoke natural selection. Now, natural selection is interesting because you can model that in genetic algorithms. You can write genetic algorithms, and the key thing, the genetic algorithm will not work unless you've carefully programmed in the right kind of fitness function to guide that search through search space to find some sort of an answer. The problem with that, though, is the moment you appeal to natural selection, you're appealing to a fitness function in nature. And the question is, how much information is required to be encoded in nature itself to find the proteins of life? Proteins are the three-dimensional structure of proteins is determined by physics, not biology. And so what a biological search must do is find these sequences that code for stable functional proteins. They're extremely rare. In fact, you can actually, don't take my word for it. Again, you can download the sequences and write your own software to do this, and it's very easy to do. The probability of finding a single average protein of, say, 300 amino acids, folding structural protein, is so small there's not enough planets in the universe, and the universe isn't old enough to find at least even one. And you can run the numbers yourself. You can run the software yourself. You can see, you don't just have to take my word for this. This has prompted a paper published in 2007 by Eugene Koonin. His response to this is there are some biologists that concede we have a serious problem when it comes to the origin of the information that encodes the proteins in the genomes of life. Once you got the software, then you can play with it and have all sorts of fun, as he's pointed out. My question is, where did the software come from? And Koonin suggests that the only real solution to this problem is that there's perhaps an infinite number of universes or an infinite number of worlds. In an infinite number of worlds, anything can happen, even the most improbable things, and therefore we can explain the origin of life. Helpful to read the comments, the critics, the reviews at the end of that. One of them points out that a good scientific explanation should be parsimonious, should be simple. You should not invoke an infinite number of unseen, untestable entities to explain the origin of proteins. That's a problem. But that is a concession that proteins are very difficult to find. To build, we can build artificial proteins, but we have to use existing proteins as a model. Because if you just start trying to build a protein at random by assembling amino acids, you're going to be in trouble very quickly. I want to move into this idea of intelligent design. My point is this. We do not have an explanation for the origin of proteins that actually works. You can run your genetic algorithms, and what you will find out is that nature's capable of maybe producing something on the order of 50 to 100 bits over a period of, say, 10 billion years, but not 400 bits of information, unless you cheat and encode a proper fitness function in. So you can say nature did produce the thing, and you could appeal to natural selection, but then the question is just set back one. Where did the information for the fitness function of nature come from? Because the information must actually, in any fitness function, it needs to have a good idea of what you're looking for, and that where it falls short of that has to be made up in randomness within your search. So you've got those two things operating simultaneously. When you're talking about intelligent design, you need to define what that is. That was not defined. I would define it as an effect which requires an intelligence to produce, i.e., the Mac operating system. That's an example of intelligent design. The Sphinx. You may even have an example such as, like the Sphinx, which is badly deteriorated, does not logically follow that therefore nobody built it. You may have an example of an operating system such as Windows that you say, why in the world did they ever build that? Like, that is not the way. There again, it does not logically follow that Microsoft just uses morons to write their software. They have a team there. Any scientist who is going to claim on scientific grounds that intelligent design was not involved in the origin of life, i.e., there was no intelligence required to, say, encode the functional information in life, the first question you need to ask that scientist, what was your scientific method? Because design detection is a part of science. It's used in forensics. It's used in SETI. It's used in archaeology. And if you're going to say intelligent design was not involved in coming up with the information encoded in the genome, you better have a scientific method that you can appeal to. I'd like to hear what that is. And the fundamental hypothesis to detect intelligence is this. The defining difference between mindless and mindful intelligent processes is the production of significant amounts of functional information, the ability to produce significant amounts of functional information, as defined by Hazen and PNAS. So that's your test. You can measure the functional information proteins, and now the problem is yours. How is nature going to produce that? And we can talk a lot more about that because I have a lecture tomorrow that deals much more thoroughly on this subject. I think my time's about up.
Dr. Myers, 12-minute response.
Okay, first a couple of things here. Mr. Durston brought up logical fallacies here. And let me just point out that in the opening to my talk, I used some humor and I made fun of the Bible. Mr. Durston accused atheists of being evil, immoral monsters. Now, is that a logical fallacy? Is there a name for this? Is it called poisoning the well? I mean, I was utterly appalled at you coming up here and making these kind of baseless accusations to large numbers of people based on bogus evidence. First of all, what is a core atheist society? Can you name one? What were these 5 that you mentioned? These top 5?
Soviet Union, Communist China, North Korea, Cambodia.
This is not a dialogue back and forth. It's a response to what he already said. Sorry about that.
You've left
That's
out
my
some rather important
prerogative.
things. What was the 5th one?
So if you would continue with those, with your field of reference?
I have just been accused of being an immoral monster. I mean, I think I can address this.
It depends whether you're a passive atheist or not.
I'm not a passive atheist. Okay, well, first of all, your examples are nonsense. This is a biased view that is invented by some idiot. Those are not societies that are core atheist societies. Those are people that are wrapped around an ideology like Marxism, Maoism, Leninism, the cult of personality in North Korea. You can't say that these are purely atheist societies or societies built around atheism. Atheism is one of the things they use to eradicate opposition. It's not a core principle of those societies. I would also mention that often what people drag out here is the idea that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and I've heard them called atheists so often. Germany is a Catholic and Lutheran country. Adolf Hitler was Catholic. The Pope at that time closed his eyes to the atrocities going on in Germany. You cannot say that atheism somehow is the cause of these kinds of atrocities. I'd also point out that Mr. Durston also accused me of having no meaning to my life, of being like toxic waste. Well, thank you. No, I happen to think that my life has a lot of meaning. My life has meaning in itself, not in some belief in some imaginary superstitious being. That what we have to do is derive meaning from our life from what we have right now, the people we live with, the families we have, the people we work with. This is where meaning comes from. It's not from this imaginary deity that he thinks is so important. The other thing I noticed in his talk is he must know what I am. I'm a biologist, right? Look at what he was pushing. He was pushing these ideas of a primal cause. He was going back to the Big Bang. He was talking about physics. He was ignoring anything to say about biology. I think that was by intent. He kind of knew what my expertise would be in, so he explicitly avoided that. I think that's kind of cheesy. Okay? Also, I think those arguments are irrelevant to the point of the debate. They do not say anything about a personal God. I mean, you might be able to convince me that there was some supernatural entity that created the universe. Sure. Show me the evidence. I mean, I'm not going to accept it right now, but that's why I said there's probably no God, is because, okay, maybe there could be something like that. But if you're talking about a personal God, you've got to be talking about something happening now. Something that's happening in real time in the real world. He's got to be intervening somewhere, and I saw no evidence for that. In fact, all the evidence we got was a bunch of Bible bullshit. I'm sorry, but you cannot propose the Bible as a premise in these debates. I don't believe in the Bible. Why should I believe one word that's written in the Bible? Show me some independent evidence. Talking about biblical prophecies, that's even more ridiculous. The Bible, all these stories of Jesus, were written like 100 years after Jesus died. There was a lot of mythological retrofitting going on there. Yes, there are these nice little prophecies buried in the Old Testament. And what did people do? Well, they cobbled up the stories to fit the prophecies. You don't think the Bible is a good biographical account of Jesus, do you? It's not. It's a bunch of nonsense built up after the fact. Okay, we're supposed to have some warrant for believing in these prophecies. I have no warrant for believing this. Why should I believe this? There's no historical evidence for the resurrection. None at all. There is no contemporary evidence of this at all. Talking about a surge in people of that time believing it, there's no accounts from the time of the crucifixion. This is invented history. He's making it up. All of these stories were written long after the fact by people who weren't there. So there's no reason to accept these. I noticed later in his talk he mentioned this thing that he objected to the scientific explanations by saying you cannot invoke infinite, invisible, untestable entities. Anybody notice the irony here? He's only invented one, but it's the biggest one you can imagine. It's just this kitchen sink full of garbage that he's thrown together. That's God, is just infinite, untestable entity, which he thinks is a mark against science, but I certainly think it's even more of a mark against religion. Another point. Mr. Durston likes to throw around big numbers. Big numbers sound impressive, don't they? All these probabilities he's tossing around, saying how many bits this has, how many bits that other thing has, telling you, without giving you any evidence, that nature has a limit on how many bits of information it can generate. Well, I would like to ask, how many bits of information differentiate Mr. Durston from his parents? Does anybody know? Any guesses? Do you think it's just a few? Do you think it's less than 150? He said this was kind of his limit. I mean, if you just look at mutations, we know the mutation rate is about 10 to the minus fifth, 10 to the minus sixth per nucleotide per division. And we know how many divisions produce the gametes that produce Mr. Durston. And so we know that he has on the order of 300 mutations in his body. So that's 300 nucleotide differences, which I think would be estimated to be about 600 bits of information right there. And that's not even accounting for recombination, which is the major source of new information in his body. So what he's just proposed is a metric that limits the amount that amount of information nature can create, that says that Mr. Durston is an unnatural being produced by unnatural means with no grounding in natural processes. And again, that's ridiculous. You can't just invent these numbers out of whole cloth and throw them out in an audience like this and expect that because he's using big numbers that you're just going to believe it. You're not that credulous. All right. Let's see. One last thing. He says he's wondering about the evolution of the software. Okay, I mentioned a few times that I'm a developmental biologist. If you read the developmental biology literature, what you will discover is that there is a universal contempt for the software analogy. DNA is not a computer program. It is not software. There is no simple encoding of instructions in the genome. When you look at the genome, what you find is many disparate elements that have to be expressed in a context, in the environment of the cell, and that development proceeds epigenetically. That what happens is that new information develops over time. All the information to make a human being is not present in the zygote, in the fertilized egg. The information to make a human being is going to emerge gradually by a process of interaction between dividing cells that will eventually lead to the complexity that we see in human beings here. So you ask me you could ask me where the software comes from, and I would tell you there is no software. You're using a faulty analogy to make your case. So again, another bogus story for Mr. Durston. This is not how development proceeds. It's not how evolution works. And with that, I'll stop.
Okay, I'm going to need the overhead here. Okay, I want to begin with something that I would caution PZ against, and that is when I make statements about atheistic societies, this does not necessarily mean that the individuals in those societies are a way he described himself or that he claimed I was describing him. What my point is this: is
sweeping generalizations about Christians then and apply.
he can make whatever generalizations he wants as long as he can back it up with the data.
Gentlemen,
The data of history shows.
stay on track. Stay on track.
Okay, check out that website. That fellow that's his whole area of expertise is mass murder throughout history. And he's tried to argue that atheism was not a central belief in communism. It very well is. I worked in the former Soviet Union, when it was still the Soviet Union. I've worked in North Korea and been educated by the North Koreans on the Juche principle. There are three fundamental aspects to that, and that is there is no God. And everything in North Korean ideology stems from that. And same with the other communist countries. That was a fundamental part of Marxism that was embraced by those countries. You could say it was communism, but communism itself doesn't do it. The communism itself, without the embracing of atheism, is rather benign. In fact, it can be helpful, altruistic. Adolf Hitler was a Catholic? Not, I'm afraid not. Adolf Hitler actually killed Catholics. When Werner Mulders, the top ace in World War II, in the Battle of Britain, who was a Catholic, found out that Adolf Hitler was imprisoning and persecuting Catholics, he turned in his medals and he turned in his Nazi party card. And a Swedish information on what happened next indicates that Werner Mulders was loaded in an aircraft, pushed out the door without a parachute, and that was the end of Germany's top ace in the Battle of Britain. There is absolutely not a shred of evidence that he was a Catholic. He might have been a Lutheran prior to that, but the point is this. Is that what Jesus taught? Is that what when you look at Adolf Hitler? Jesus said, you will know them by their fruit. PZ insists he has a meaning to life, but if he's rational, he has to admit he made it up. There's no objective meaning to life. There's no purpose for existence. We make up our own. It might be to discover a cure for cancer. It might be to assault people. It might be to help the old lady across the street or be good. You just make up your own if there is no objective meaning to life. You can convince yourself that there is meaning to life, but it's like believing in the Easter Bunny. So if PZ believes that there is actually meaning to life that's objective, it's similar to belief in leprechauns and fairies. Ignoring biology. There is a reason why I don't normally get into it in a debate, and that's simply because there's so much education that has to go on before you can even present your argument. But my response is this. What is his explanation for proteins? The information difference between myself and my parents, his description reveals to me he needs to read Hazen's paper in PNAS on functional information. There is virtually no functional information difference between me and my parents. The information already exists. The components, the modules already exist. There's reshuffling of the existing information. You can have mutations, and there's a limit to how much you can produce. Take a look at this. This is for an evolutionary search. Have I got any hope of getting up there? Let's detect the displays here. Okay, you just don't toss out numbers. That's true. I have no idea what that's doing in the middle of my page. Let's hypothesize a population of size of 10 to the 30. Replication rate every 30 minutes, mutation rate, and so on and so forth. Total number of trials over 4 billion years for all of life is about 10 raised to the 42nd power. You can plug that into an equation as to how much functional information can be generated in an evolutionary search that gives that many trials. And it comes up with I can't remember the exact number, it's about 140 bits. And I'm being very generous here. In other words, he's asserted that this doesn't work or this works. There's a lot of assertions going on, but you need to back that up with science. And so anyone who believes you can actually do that, write a genetic algorithm. Don't cheat on your search function or your fitness function. Actually encode a realistic fitness function that is within nature. Lenski has done that and found in his little run he could generate as much as 42 bits. No, 32. But that was with 2 and 4-bit stepping stones. In real life, the informational gap between different proteins is more in the order of 200 or 300 bits of information. He says the cosmological argument is irrelevant because it's not personal. Well, my point in bringing out that it seems to be fine-tuned to support life, as Paul Davies has pointed out, if there's fine-tuning to support life on this planet, there must be a purpose. There must be some reason why it's that way. What was this? Cannot vote an infinite number. Oh, yeah. And invoking an infinite number of unseen untestable entities. Use Occam's razor. Just invoke one. However, you don't even need to have to do that. My initial argument logically showed you have to have a non-natural origin for the origin of nature. If he wants to refute that argument, what he has to do, in logic, is to show which one of those propositions is false. He's failed to do that, and therefore my argument still stands. I'm not simply invoking a supernatural origin
Finish your thought.
Of nature. What I've done is I've logically derived that in order to avoid the circular fallacy. Cannot propose the Bible as a premise. How much time do I got left? 30 seconds?
30 seconds.
None.
He says 0, but 30 seconds.
Oh, man. He's made wild assertions about the historicity of the New Testament documents. Check out Tacitus. Check out Josephus Flavius. Roman historians who lived at the time, not Christians. See what they say about Jesus. Check out the earliest part of the Jewish Talmud. I had several overheads to point that out, but out of time. So don't just accept assertions.
There will now be, take a deep breath, everyone. There will now be 5 minutes, no new arguments, closing remarks from Dr. Myers.
Okay, what have we seen here from Mr. Durston tonight? We have seen bad history and bad science. I mean, incredibly bad. This is wingnut science that I'm seeing paraded here. First of all, Hitler was not a Catholic. Have you read these books that Hitler penned? Have you read Mein Kampf? You won't find any mention of evolution or atheism in there, but you will find God invoked multiple times. You listen to his speeches, and what he is doing is he is appealing to the religious sensibilities of the German people to fight for the homeland. Yes, you can find he killed a great many people, including Catholics. So what? He was a mass murderer. He was not very discriminating. I mean, if you looked among those 6 million Jews that he murdered, I think you might be able to find a few atheists there as well. So he's targeting all of these people, and yet this is done in the name of the German homeland, in the name of God. We can also look back in history. Atheism before the 20th century has not been a dominant factor in the history of the world. There haven't been that many atheists, and there have been very few of them that have had any ability to rule at all. So are we going to blame the pogroms against the Jews that occurred well before the 20th century on atheists? I don't think so. I think you could maybe perhaps read Martin Luther and discover that there's something going on there. The bad science, again, he did it again. He threw out a bunch of numbers here. What he has to do is wave his hands and say that the many differences between him and his parents are not significant. That's very interesting. I mean, I suspect that if we had his parents here, a photo of his parents, we put them up, you could look at them and you could see that there are some significant differences. He's not a clone of his mother or his father. That there are these significant differences, these many bits of information are generated, and they are important. You can't just wave them away and say it doesn't matter. So what we've got here is again, creationist nonsense being peddled in opposition to science. It just doesn't work. In his last few words there, he threw out more examples of bad history. Flavius Josephus? Any history people here? Anyone know about the Flavian text? Yeah.
Don't respond. Don't respond. Continue on.
Okay. It's a later insertion. This is acknowledged by historians everywhere.
Except for the Arabic text.
Don't respond.
No, it is a later insertion. This was a document that was translated and preserved by Christian monks. It's a weird little sentence stuck in the middle of a paragraph. It has no relationship to anything around it. It's just a claim that Jesus was King of the Jews, etc., and that he was brought back from the dead. And this was clearly something that was added after the fact. There are no serious scholars that think this is actually good evidence for the existence of Jesus. The documentation for his existence all comes later. The various prophecies that he's claimed to have fulfilled all just cobbled together. There's no reason to think the Bible is true. I mean, why not accept the Bhagavad Gita? Seems just as valid to me. And I'm sure that there are Hindu scholars who sit around coming up with all kinds of excuses to make this the literal truth of the world. It doesn't make it so. Theology is an exercise in post facto reasoning. and I'm not going to accept it. Okay, I'll stop there.